The wind off Bear Mountain cut sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant snow. Luke Ashbourne, broad as a barn door beneath his worn brown vest, adjusted the brim of his weather-beaten cowboy hat and kept climbing the narrow trail. His boots found the same stones they had found every October for 12 years. The pack at his shoulder was light, just a few wild forget-me-nots wrapped in a cloth, and his steps were slow, almost ceremonial. This was the one day he let himself walk back into memory. He crested the last rise, expecting the little cemetery to be empty, the way it always was. Only the old fence and the 3 small headstones nestled between the pines. But halfway through his next breath he stopped cold. A child knelt at Elizabeth's grave. Not some stray fawn or traveler, but a girl, small and trembling, her dark hair tangled with autumn leaves. She was whispering his wife's name as if she knew her. Luke's throat went dry. He hadn't spoken to another soul in months. Now, across the clearing, a little girl in a pale blue dress sat on her knees in the brown needles, a bouquet of forget-me-nots clutched in her fists. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. She looked too delicate for the mountain air, too town-bred for this hidden path. And she had no business knowing this grave existed. No one did but him. The mountain man, who had carried grief like an extra weight for over a decade, felt something crack open. He stepped forward slowly, boots whispering against the pine duff. His shadow stretched across the clearing until it touched the edge of the girl's dress. She startled and looked up. Large dark eyes met his, full of fear and something else recognition. "I'm sorry," she said, in a voice as thin as wind through needles. "I didn't mean to be where I shouldn't. Mama told me to find her if I ever got lost." She glanced at the headstone again, lips moving carefully over the carved letters. Elizabeth Ashbourne. Is this her? Luke's jaw clenched. "Yes," he managed. "She was my wife." The words came out rough from disuse, but they landed between them like a stone in water. The girl's grip on the flowers tightened. "Then you must be Luke. Mama told me about you. She said you loved Elizabeth more than the mountains love the sky." The poetry of it hit him like a blow. It sounded exactly like something Elizabeth might have said. He moved a few steps closer, close enough to see the mud on the child's shoes, the tear tracks on her cheeks. "What's your name, little one?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." She drew herself up a little, as if her name were a shield. "Mama said if anything happened, I should come here. She said Elizabeth would help me find my way." Luke's eyes swept the clearing, scanning for a wagon, a horse, any sign of an adult. "Who brought you up here, Sarah?" "Nobody." Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze. "I walked since yesterday morning. Slept under a tree last night, but I wasn't too scared. Mama said if I kept going, I'd get close to Elizabeth and she'd make me safe." Luke's heart twisted. A child alone on mountain trails this time of year could have been lost to cold or bears or worse. He crouched down, lowering his huge frame to her level. "You're safe now," he said. "But you can't stay up here alone. It's not safe for little girls, no matter what your mama said." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. "I don't have anywhere else to go. Mama's gone to be with the angels. She told me to find Elizabeth." She didn't say what to do after the words hit Luke like a hammer. He knew that slow, merciless fever. He had nursed Elizabeth through it until it stole her breath and left him with only silence. He reached out, then stopped himself, his big hand hovering uncertainly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm truly sorry for your loss." Sarah sniffled and looked down at the flowers. "Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house said maybe I had family somewhere, but Mama never talked about anyone except Elizabeth. She said Elizabeth was an angel walking on earth. She said she gave her a new start when everything was dark and scary." Luke's mind reeled. Elizabeth had always been generous, taking food to neighbors, helping with childbirths, but this sounded like something deeper, more secret. "When did your mama know Elizabeth?" he asked. "A long time ago. Before I was born, Sarah's small fingers fumbled in her dress pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. This is her. My mama, Mary. She said Elizabeth saved her life once the picture was faded, edges soft from handling. A younger woman with fair hair held a baby in her arms. Luke studied the face but found no recognition. Yet something about the way the woman looked at the child felt familiar. He gave the photo back carefully. "I don't remember her. But Elizabeth knew many people. She always tried to help." He glanced at the sky. The sun was lowering, the October chill creeping in. "Sarah, you're coming with me. We'll go down to my cabin before it gets dark. We'll figure the rest out there." She hesitated. "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not trouble," Luke said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "You're under my protection now." She rose, swaying a little from exhaustion. He steadied her with a hand the size of a dinner plate. Her small palm slipped trustingly into his. It had been 12 years since he had felt a hand that small in his. Something warm and dangerous stirred in his chest purpose. As they started down the trail, the wind shifted through the pines, whispering like a voice he almost recognized. For the first time since Elizabeth's death, Luke felt the weight of his promise to her, the one he had broken by letting the cabin become a tomb. Maybe this child was not an intrusion, but an answer. Maybe Elizabeth's story wasn't finished after all. Below them, the last rays of sun set the peaks on fire. Luke glanced back once at the grave. The wild forget-me-nots Sarah had brought lay beside his own bundle, blue against the grey stone. 2 offerings, 2 lives, tied to one woman's name. He squeezed the little girl's hand. "Hold on, Sarah," he said softly. "The mountain nights get cold, but we'll be home soon." He didn't add what echoed in his mind, that something or someone had led this child straight to him, and that whatever secret Elizabeth had kept might now be walking beside him down the trail. Somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk called, sharp and distant. Luke lifted his head, sensing movement on the far ridge. A glint of metal caught the dying light and vanished. Maybe it was nothing but a hunter's rifle barrel. Maybe it was something else. Either way, he felt the old instincts wake up. The mountain wasn't as empty as it had seemed, and the arrival of this child might have stirred dangers he couldn't yet see. He shifted his weight, pulling Sarah a little closer. The trail to his cabin had never felt so narrow or so full of unseen eyes. The cabin felt different with a child inside it. Luke Ashbourne had lived in silence for so long he could measure a season by how long the fire crackled after midnight or how quickly the wind shifted direction off the ridge. But now, as he poured water into the kettle and stole a glance at the small figure curled up on the couch beneath Elizabeth's old quilt, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, tentative, uncertain, but full. Sarah had fallen asleep sitting upright, her knees drawn to her chest, one hand still clutching the hem of her dress. Luke had laid a folded blanket beneath her head and tucked the other quilt around her like he remembered Elizabeth doing years ago for neighbors' children. The girl hadn't made a sound since they crossed the threshold. She slept now under a half-finished patchwork of interlocking hearts. Elizabeth had started it during a snow-bound winter long ago, but never finished it before the illness took her. Luke had never moved it from the cedar chest. Tonight, something told him it needed to be used again. He sat in the rocking chair, the one he had made for Elizabeth the second winter after they were married, and watched the firelight play across Sarah's face. There was something in her profile. A fragility, yes, but also a deep stubbornness. She had made it up the mountain alone. That took more than desperation. It took grit. Outside, wind moved through the pines like a slow breath, brushing against the cabin walls. Inside, warmth bloomed from the hearth, and for the first time in 12 years, Luke didn't feel like a ghost inside his own home. He reached into the drawer where he kept old photographs. Not many. Elizabeth had never liked posing, but enough. There, tucked between two yellowing recipe cards, was one of the last they had taken together. She stood beside him, holding a basket of apples from the first decent harvest. Her smile in the picture made him catch his breath. He hadn't looked at it in a long time. Luke closed the drawer and stood. His legs carried him, without much thought, to the bedroom he hadn't entered in over a year. He stepped carefully, as if afraid to disturb something holy. Elizabeth's side of the room remained untouched. Her books still sat stacked on the small table. Her scarf hung over the bedpost. He walked to her jewelry box on the dresser, its carved lid worn smooth by years of her hands. He hesitated only a moment, then opened it. Inside, nestled among old ribbons and hairpins, lay her silver locket. He hadn't touched it since the day she died. Elizabeth had worn it every day of their marriage, except those last weeks when the weight around her neck became too much to bear. He remembered removing it for her, her fingers lingering over the chain one final time. Now he held it again. The locket was oval-shaped, simple but elegant, worn soft with age. He turned it over in his hand, and something odd caught his attention. A faint notch on the side he hadn't noticed before. He pressed gently. With a soft click, a hidden compartment opened. Inside, folded tight, was a slip of paper no larger than a postage stamp. He unfolded it slowly, the handwriting so familiar it made his throat tighten. Clara Henderson, 47, Oak Street, Millbrook. He read it twice, then again. The name rang no bell, but the neatness of the handwriting, the deliberateness of hiding it in the locket, Elizabeth had meant for someone to find it, just not him. Not until now. Luke moved back into the main room. The girl was still asleep, the fire casting golden light across her features. He sat in the rocking chair again and watched her, that folded address burning a hole in his palm. As if sensing him, Sarah stirred and sat up groggily. She blinked a few times, taking in her surroundings. "It's warm," she said, voice scratchy with sleep. "Smells like cinnamon and smoke." "Mountain nights turn fast," Luke said. "You were out too long." Sarah looked down at the quilt around her. Her fingers traced the unfinished stitching. "It's pretty," she murmured. "My mama loved hearts." She said they were reminders. Not just of love, but of survival. Luke raised an eyebrow. "That's so." She nodded, more alert now. "She used to tell me stories when we walked. Said the world could be cruel, but there were hidden people who helped. Said they were like angels without wings." Her eyes met his. She always called Elizabeth one of them. Luke shifted forward in his chair. "Sarah, what exactly did your mama say about Elizabeth?" Sarah drew her knees to her chest again, her small frame swallowed by the quilt. "That she helped women disappear. Women who needed to escape men that hurt them. She said Elizabeth gave them safe places, new names sometimes. She helped them breathe again." Luke's stomach turned. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Did she say how she knew her?" Sarah reached into her dress pocket again and pulled out the worn photograph. "Mama said Elizabeth gave her work, taught her to can peaches, told her she was worth saving, that nobody belonged to a man who hurt them." Luke took the photo again, studying it in the firelight. The woman in it, Mary, had gentle eyes, but there was fear at the edges of her smile. The baby in her arms was unmistakably Sarah. He handed the picture back. "Your mama," he said slowly, "was a strong woman." Sarah nodded. "She was scared a lot. But she never let me see it, except at night. I'd hear her crying sometimes. She'd whisper things like, 'Thank you, Elizabeth,' over and over, and he's still out there." Luke's jaw tensed. Who was still out there? Sarah's lips quivered. She never said his name. But she'd get real quiet when strangers came around the boarding house. She said one day he might find us, that if something happened, I had to run. She made me memorize the name Elizabeth Ashbourne and told me to follow the mountains. Luke sat back, heart pounding now. Everything Elizabeth had ever done, every late-night sewing project, every extra jar of preserves she sent to town, every visit she claimed was helping a neighbor. He had believed it all. Now it seemed like she had been running an entire network under his nose. And this address, Millbrook, Clara Henderson. Was that where the others went? Luke? Sarah's voice was hesitant. He looked over at her. I don't mean to be trouble, she said. I didn't know where else to go. Mama said this place was safe. He rose from the chair and knelt beside her. You're not trouble, Sarah. You're exactly where you're meant to be. He paused, then added, You said your mama believed Elizabeth helped people start over. She nodded. Well, Luke said, rising slowly, maybe it's time we find out how she did it. He walked back to the dresser and picked up the folded slip of paper. Millbrook wasn't close. It would take days on horseback, and the trail would be dangerous with snow coming early this year. But something told him Elizabeth had left him this breadcrumb for a reason. And suddenly, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone else knew it too. He moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just slightly. The moon cast a cold light over the trees. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, movement. A flicker of reflection on the edge of the ridgeline. Gone as quick as it appeared. Maybe an animal. Maybe something else. He let the curtain fall. Behind him, Sarah had curled back under the quilt. But sleep didn't return to him that night. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what he'd heard, because if Mary Mitchell had been running from someone, and if Elizabeth had helped her vanish, that someone might still be looking, and they might not stop just because Mary was dead. The next morning broke quiet and gold, with light streaming through the pines in long, lazy shafts. Luke Ashbourne stood outside the cabin, saddle cinched tight on his bay gelding, eyes cast toward the ridgeline. The air was crisp with autumn's breath, and frost still clung to the grass beneath his boots. Sarah stood on the porch steps, bundled in Elizabeth's old riding coat that nearly swallowed her whole. Her hair was braided now, not neatly, but tight enough to last a few days. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile than she had the night before. But there was a steadiness in her eyes that made Luke pause. It reminded him of Elizabeth in the early years, before illness, before silence, when her courage had filled a room without her needing to raise her voice. You ready? He asked. Sarah nodded. I think so. Luke knelt to double-check the saddlebags and slipped the folded address into an inside pocket of his coat. Millbrook was nearly 2 counties south. The roads would twist through old mining trails, abandoned homesteads, and at least one pass known for spring floods and early snow. But his gut told him this trip wasn't optional. It was a calling, the kind you don't ignore. He helped Sarah onto the saddle first, then swung up behind her. She sat stiff at first, but relaxed the moment he took the reins. The gelding snorted once, then stepped forward with the calm assurance of a seasoned trail horse. The cabin faded into the trees behind them. They rode for an hour in silence, winding through golden meadows and dry creek beds where the leaves had fallen in wide copper drifts. The wind made the aspens tremble like nervous whispers, and every now and then a squirrel chattered overhead. It was the kind of autumn day that felt borrowed from heaven, clear, crisp, and waiting for something to happen. Luke glanced down at the girl. You ever been outside town before? Not much, Sarah replied. Mama didn't like staying in one place long. Said we weren't meant to grow roots. She say why? Sarah's hands twisted in the fabric of the coat. She said roots can be pulled, and people find you easier when you stay still. Luke absorbed that. The way she said it didn't sound like a child mimicking adult fears. It sounded lived in, practiced, like running had been the only thing she ever learned to do. She ever tell you who you were running from? Sarah hesitated. then nodded. His name was Blackjack Morrison. Luke's fingers tightened around the reins. He knew that name. Everyone who rode cattle or served in the Union Army around these parts knew it. Morrison had once worked as a bounty hunter, then turned outlaw when the money got better on the other side of the badge. There were rumors he trafficked people, especially women who couldn't fight back. There were darker whispers, too. Things never spoken out loud. "You sure that's the name?" Luke asked, voice low. Sarah's head dipped in a nod. "Mama said if I ever heard that name, I had to run, that if I saw a man with silver rings on every finger, to hide and not come out. She said he owned people, or thought he did, and he never forgot a face." Luke exhaled slowly. He had fought off bandits before. Rustlers. Wolves. Even the odd drifter trying to take what didn't belong to him. But this was different. This wasn't just about a grieving child or a mystery in a locket. It was about survival. Sarah leaned back slightly. "Do you think he's still looking for us?" Luke didn't answer right away. The trail curved around a stand of birches, and in the distance, the glint of a frozen stream caught the sunlight like a silver ribbon. He pulled the horse to a stop near the bank and helped Sarah down. "Time to stretch your legs," he said. She stepped lightly across the frost-bitten grass and knelt at the water's edge, cupping her hands to drink. Luke filled a canteen and scanned the trees. The quiet felt too quiet, like something watching from just beyond reach. But it might have just been the stories, the memory of Morrison's name still heavy in the air. "I don't know if he's still looking," he said finally. "But if he is, he won't find you easy." "Not on my watch." Sarah smiled, just barely. "Mama would have liked you." Luke's heart tugged unexpectedly. He cleared his throat and glanced up the trail. "We should keep moving." Got a long road ahead. They rode through a grove of cottonwoods, their yellow leaves flickering like coins in the breeze. Time moved slow in the saddle, but the air felt charged, like thunder somewhere far off. That evening, they camped near the base of Cold Water Ridge, a place Luke remembered from his cattle driving days. He showed Sarah how to gather dry kindling, how to spot poison ivy, how to tie a proper hitch knot. She listened with wide eyes, soaking in every word. "You ever been a father?" she asked quietly over the crackle of the fire. Luke shook his head. "No. Did you want to be?" He didn't answer for a long time. The fire crackled and the stars began to poke through the velvet sky. "I did," he said at last. "Once. We tried. But it never happened." Sarah hugged her knees. "Maybe God just waited to send you the right one." Luke looked at her, then truly looked. At her worn shoes, the way her elbows poked out from Elizabeth's old coat, how her eyes never stayed still for long, like she was always waiting for something bad to sneak up from behind. "Maybe," he said. She fell asleep against his shoulder not long after, and Luke stayed up, staring into the flames. The fire hissed as a log split down the middle, throwing sparks into the air. He thought about Elizabeth, about the network she had apparently been a part of, helping women vanish, escape, start over. It explained so much. The late nights, the unexplained visits, the tension in her voice on certain mornings. And it meant Sarah's arrival hadn't been random. It was deliberate. Fated, maybe. As he stirred the embers, he heard a distant snap branches breaking somewhere beyond the firelight. He stood silently, hand on his rifle. Nothing followed. The night remained still, but as he sat back down and placed another log on the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone in the woods, and that whatever trail they were riding toward Millbrook, someone else had already taken it and might just be waiting for them to catch up. Millbrook was the kind of town that looked like it had been built by people too tired to dream and too stubborn to quit. Just two dusty streets, a leaning church, a crooked sheriff's office, and a boarding house that sat behind a wrought iron gate wrapped in ivy and secrets. Luke Ashbourne reined in his gelding in front of the gate. Sarah sat in front of him in the saddle, stiff and silent. Her eyes scanned the porch, the windows, the faint movement behind lace curtains. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the town's stillness made her nervous. Luke dismounted and lifted Sarah down gently. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting everything in a soft amber glow. The sign on the wooden post read, "Henderson House, Rooms for Ladies. Fresh starts, welcome." He knocked. It took a minute, but the door creaked open and a woman in her 60s appeared, eyes sharp beneath a cloud of white hair coiled into a loose bun. She wore a navy dress, well pressed, and an apron with flower along the hem. Her gaze scanned Luke warily, but when it landed on Sarah, her whole expression softened. "You lost?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Luke said, removing his hat. "Looking for Clara Henderson." "I'm Clara," she said slowly. He pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket and held it out. "This address was hidden in my wife's locket. Elizabeth Ashbourne. She passed 12 years ago. Clara didn't take the paper. She didn't need to. At the mention of Elizabeth's name, her whole face shifted. Grief and recognition moved like a shadow across her brow. "You better come in," she said. Inside, the boarding house smelled like cinnamon and old pine. The floors creaked under Luke's boots as Clara led them to a sitting room with tall windows, faded curtains, and a fire already going low. Sarah curled up on a settee without needing to be asked. Her eyes roamed the room. She was clearly used to new places, but never quite at ease in them. Clara stood by the fireplace, arms folded. "Elizabeth was one of us," she said, voice low, though she didn't talk about it often. Never wanted credit. Just wanted the work to get done. Luke remained standing. "What kind of work?" Clara gave him a long look. The kind that saved women from men who thought they owned them. From fists, from worse. From places no law dared reach. We ran routes through Colorado, Wyoming, even into Kansas. Sometimes just food and shelter. Sometimes new names, new lives. Luke's throat tightened. And Elizabeth. She was one of our strongest links. Trusted, smart, kind. She took the hard ones, the desperate ones. If a woman was in danger and had nowhere left to go, we sent her to Elizabeth. Luke took a seat, the weight of it all pressing on him. "Why didn't she tell me?" "She was protecting you," Clara said simply. "The less you knew, the safer you both were." These men didn't knock before coming. They set fires. They shot dogs. You had a name folks respected. That helped, but your wife carried the risk. Luke stared into the fire, silent for a long time. "And Mary Mitchell?" he asked. Clara blinked. "That name I do know. Sweet girl. Came here battered, scared to death, holding her baby like a lifeline. Sarah, wasn't it?" Sarah looked up at the sound of her name. "My mama stayed here?" Clara's eyes softened again. She came over and sat beside the girl. "She did, sweetheart. Not long, maybe 3 months. But she helped with the kitchen, made the best cornbread I ever had. She used to sing to you while sweeping the stairs." Sarah smiled faintly. She liked to sing when she was afraid. Said if she kept singing, the fear couldn't take root. Clara looked at Luke. "We thought Mary was safe. But one day she packed up fast. Said she'd gotten word he was close." Luke's voice was gravel. "Blackjack Morrison." Clara's jaw tightened. "He's still out there." "We don't know," Luke said. "But I've seen signs we're being watched. I think someone's following us." Clara stood and crossed to a tall cabinet, unlocking it with a brass key she pulled from her apron. Inside were ledgers, envelopes, and a worn wooden box. She opened the box and pulled out a thin file. "This is Mary's. We kept records when we could. In case we ever needed to prove identity or track someone," she handed it to Luke. Inside were papers, old receipts, a half-torn boarding pass, even a photo of Mary holding Sarah on the back porch of this very house. And there, at the bottom, a letter. It was addressed to Elizabeth. Dear Liz, if something happens to me, please take care of Sarah. She's more you than me, even now. She sees the good in people. I've tried so hard to keep us safe, but I don't think I'll last. Thank you for everything, for saving me when no one else would, for giving me hope. If she finds you, she's meant to be yours. Mary Luke felt the words burn into his skin. His chest tightened until it ached. He handed the letter to Clara and sat back hard into the chair. Sarah's voice was quiet, but clear. Mama wanted me to find you. I think she always did. Clara nodded. And maybe Elizabeth knew too. Sometimes women leave each other clues. Little threads were meant to follow. Luke looked toward the window, where twilight had begun to fall over the rooftops of Millbrook. He felt the shift deep in his gut. This wasn't just about honoring Elizabeth's memory anymore. This was about protecting something she had risked her life to build. Something or someone was trying to unravel it. Outside, a wagon creaked down the street, followed by the rhythmic thud of hooves. Normal sounds for a small town at dusk, but Luke stood anyway. Instinct. Clara met his eyes. You'll want to stay here a few nights. Rest, regroup, the house is safe. No man crosses this threshold without my say-so. I appreciate it, Luke said. But if Morrison's got wind we're here, we don't have much time. Clara's eyes narrowed. You think he followed you? I think he never stopped. Luke's voice was low and certain. And if he finds out Sarah's alive, he won't stop now. As Clara moved to close the curtains, a figure passed by the window, not quickly, not aimlessly, just slow enough to look in, just long enough to know exactly who was inside. The boarding house had gone quiet after supper. Most of the women had retired to their rooms, lamps dimmed behind doors. Only the smell of baking bread drifted from the kitchen, a sign of Clara's endless routine. Luke sat at the parlor table, elbows resting on the worn oak surface, hat beside him. Sarah slept curled on a couch across the room, Elizabeth's quilt tucked under her chin. Even in sleep she clutched the little silver locket as if it were a lifeline. Clara came in carrying a heavy, leather-bound book. Its edges were rubbed smooth by years of hands. She set it down between them and opened to the first page without ceremony. Your wife kept better records than a sheriff, she said softly. Everything she did for us, every woman she sheltered, every risk she took. This book is the backbone of the work she built. Luke reached out, hesitating a moment before touching the pages. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elizabeth's neat, steady script filled every margin, sometimes accompanied by pressed flowers or scraps of fabric like tiny memorials. He turned a page. The name Mary Mitchell appeared in the left column. Beside it, a notation in Elizabeth's hand. Safe with Mrs. Peterson. Needs new papers. Infant thriving. Clara slid an envelope across the table. This was addressed to you. She wrote it weeks before she died, but never got to send it. It was in the bundle she left with me in case the worst happened. Luke stared at the envelope. The sight of his name written in Elizabeth's hand after 12 years of silence made his throat close. He unfolded the letter slowly. My dearest Luke, by the time you read this, you may know more about me than I ever dared tell you. Forgive me for keeping secrets. I wanted you safe. I wanted you free to live without looking over your shoulder. The work I've done helping women escape is dangerous, but I could never walk away. There is one more thing, Luke. Mary Mitchell and her daughter Sarah need you. If Mary dies, promise me you'll take the child as your own. I've begun the papers to make her Sarah Elizabeth Ashbourne. She belongs with you, You're the only man I trust to raise her safe. If you find her, she's yours as surely as if she were born to us." "All my love," Elizabeth Luke closed his eyes. For a long time, neither of them spoke. He felt the old cabin on Bear Mountain shift in his memory. Elizabeth's rocking chair, her sewing basket, the unfinished quilt. All those years he'd thought he was honoring her by keeping her things untouched. In truth, she'd been leaving instructions for a life still waiting to unfold. "She planned it," he murmured. "She planned for Mary to die, for Sarah to come to me." Clara nodded. "Elizabeth was a teacher before she was your wife. She always thought ahead. She always left a path for someone to follow." Luke's hands shook as he turned another page in the ledger. There, in Elizabeth's careful script, was a draft of legal documents, an affidavit of guardianship, adoption papers, even a baptismal certificate with Sarah's name altered. Sarah Elizabeth Ashbourne, daughter of Luke and Elizabeth Ashbourne, Bear Mountain, Colorado Territory. He let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a groan. She was going to make her ours. Not just in secret, but in law. "That's what she wanted," Clara said. "And now she's put it in your hands." Luke stared across the room at Sarah's sleeping form. Her face in the firelight was a mirror of every choice Elizabeth had made. The girl was not just a responsibility dropped at his feet. She was the final piece of his wife's unfinished work. "I don't know if I'm the man she thought I was," he said, voice low. Clara leaned forward, her lined face earnest. "Elizabeth did. She saw something in you none of us ever doubted. You can choose not to believe it, but she already did." Luke looked down at the papers again. He remembered Elizabeth's last winter, the way she'd reached for his hand at night even when she couldn't speak. She had been planning this even then, while she was dying, not only to save a child, but to save him from becoming a ghost on a mountain. He folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "If Mary's gone, Sarah's mine. I'll make it official." Clara exhaled, relief flickering across her features. "Then you've kept her last promise." Luke glanced at the window. The curtains were drawn, but he felt a presence outside, like the woods back home, when a cougar's eyes followed you unseen. "This house is safe?" he asked. "As safe as it can be," Clara replied. "But the man who wants her, men like him don't respect walls." Luke rose, crossing to Sarah. He knelt and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. She stirred but didn't wake. In that moment, she was no longer just an orphan to him. She was Elizabeth's daughter. She was his. He looked back at Clara. "If Morrison finds us, I won't run." "I'll do what needs to be done." Clara met his gaze squarely. "Elizabeth knew you'd say that." Luke stood and drew the curtain back an inch. Down the street, under the weak glow of the town's single gas lamp, a rider sat motionless on a dark horse, hat pulled low. He wasn't moving on. He was waiting. Luke let the curtain fall and stepped back. "He's here." The house had gone still, as if it sensed the danger before the people inside did. Luke stood by the window, curtain drawn just enough to see the street. The rider he'd glimpsed an hour earlier was no longer alone. Two more had joined him, shapes on horseback just beyond the glow of the gas lamp. They weren't talking. They weren't moving on. They were waiting. Clara came into the parlor, wiping her hands on her apron. "You saw them?" she asked quietly. Luke nodded. 3 of them now. Morrison and his hired guns. Her face tightened. "He found you faster than I feared." Across the room, Sarah sat up on the couch, clutching the locket. She looked between them, reading the tension in their faces. "Is it him?" she whispered. "Mama's nightmares." Luke crossed to her and went down on one knee. "It's him. But you're safe with me, Sarah. Do you hear me? You're safe." Clara shut the parlor doors and dropped her voice to a whisper. "We can't let them see her." The cellar. We built it for times like this. Elizabeth helped me plan it. Luke scooped Sarah into his arms. Show me. They moved quickly through the kitchen, past the pantry to a trapdoor cleverly hidden beneath a false shelf. Clara pulled the shelf aside, revealing a wooden panel with an iron ring. Luke lifted it easily, muscles moving under his shirt. A gust of cool air rose from below, carrying the scent of earth and stone. "Get her down there," Clara said. "I'll deal with him." Luke hesitated. "You can't stand him off alone." "I've been dealing with men like him for 20 years, Clara replied. "I know how to stall." "You just keep her quiet." Luke climbed down into the cellar, boots landing on packed dirt. He set Sarah on her feet. The space was larger than he expected, lined with shelves of preserves, blankets, and lanterns. A small writing desk sat against one wall, covered in papers in Elizabeth's handwriting. The sight of it sent a jolt through him. Above them, a heavy fist pounded on the front door. The sound reverberated through the floorboards. "Open up, ma'am," a voice called. It was deeper than Luke had imagined, smooth with false warmth. "I'm looking for my daughter." "She's just a little girl, lost and scared." "Please, ma'am. A father's been searching a long time." Sarah's hand tightened around Luke's sleeve. Her eyes were huge in the dim light. "That's him," she whispered. Luke crouched beside her. "Stay behind me." "Don't make a sound." Above, Clara's voice answered, calm but firm. "You're mistaken. This is a boarding house for ladies. There's no little girl here." The man's voice came again, softer now, almost coaxing. "I don't mean harm. I just want to see her. Her name's Sarah." "My Sarah." Luke felt Sarah press her face against his arm. He put a hand over hers, steadying her trembling fingers. He could hear the boots of the other two men moving around upstairs, the dull thud of furniture being shifted. Clara was keeping them in the parlor, talking, stalling, but the tension in her voice was like a stretched wire. Luke turned to the desk. Papers lay in careful stacks. Maps of routes between towns, lists of contacts, letters from women thanking Elizabeth. And there, half completed, were legal documents. He picked up the top sheet. His own name filled one line, Elizabeth's on another. Below them, in his wife's neat script, Sarah Elizabeth Ashbourne, daughter. Luke stared at the paper. His wife had not only dreamed of saving this child, she had tried to make it law. His chest tightened. It was all here. The affidavits of guardianship, instructions for a judge sympathetic to their cause. She had planned everything, but she hadn't lived long enough to see it through. Another knock shook the boards above. This time there was no mistaking the menace in Morrison's voice. "Ma'am, I've been patient. I know she's here. My men are checking the rooms. Best to hand her over before someone gets hurt." Clara's tone sharpened. "You'll get a warrant or you'll get out." Luke slid the papers into his coat. He glanced at Sarah. She was pale but steady, her dark eyes fixed on his face. "Elizabeth wanted you to be mine," he whispered. "She wanted me to protect you. I'm going to finish what she started." Above, a chair toppled. Boots stomped across the floor. Clara's voice rose, indignant, demanding they leave. Luke pulled Sarah close, his mind racing. They were running out of time. A board creaked overhead, directly above the cellar entrance. Sarah's whisper trembled. "They're going to find us." Luke tightened his arm around her. "Not if I move first." He scanned the cellar, looking for another exit. On the far wall, half hidden behind crates of canned peaches, was a narrow tunnel sloping upward. He crossed the room and pushed the crates aside with one arm. Cool air wafted from the opening, Elizabeth planning again, a hidden way out. Luke turned back to Sarah. "We're leaving. Now. Stay right behind me." Above, Morrison's voice thundered one last time. I'm done playing games." The trapdoor creaked, hinges strained. Dust sifted down from the ceiling as someone pried it open. Luke ducked into the tunnel, pulling Sarah after him just as the cellar door began to lift. He heard the first boot hit the steps and Clara's voice shout something sharp and defiant. Then he and Sarah were crawling into the darkness, the papers against his chest, his wife's unfinished promise burning like a brand. The tunnel angled upward toward the night. Luke could already smell the cold air, but behind him a new sound cut through the noise of their escape. A man's voice, low and certain, echoing down the passageway. "I'll find you, Sarah," Morrison called. "You're mine. No mountain will keep you from me." Luke shoved Sarah forward into the dark, his jaw set. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a hunt, and the next move would be his. The mountain trail was a ghost of a path, barely more than animal tracks threading between jagged rocks and twisted pines. Most folks wouldn't have seen it at all, but Luke had known this land longer than he'd known most people. It had raised him, taught him to hunt, to track, to vanish. And now it would have to save him and Sarah. He kept her close behind as they climbed, her little boots slipping now and then on loose shale. The stars overhead blinked through the pine canopy, cold and white. Each gust of wind carried the scent of moss, earth, and danger. Below them, faint but growing louder, came the sound of hooves. "They're following us," Sarah whispered, breath ragged. Luke glanced back. "They can't track what they can't see. Keep moving. Stay close to the edge." The trail curled upward like a question mark carved into the face of the mountain. Trees thinned as they climbed, giving way to granite outcroppings and scrub brush. The air grew colder, sharper. At one point, Luke paused and scanned the terrain below. Torches flickered in the dark, 3 riders at least, weaving slowly up the slope. "They're spread out," Luke muttered. "Trying to flush us." Sarah's eyes widened. "Can they find the trail?" "Not unless they've hunted these mountains for 20 years. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We've got one shot. There's an old miner's cabin near the eastern ridge. High ground, good cover. Just one way in." They pressed on. It was nearly dawn when the cabin came into view. A weathered shack clinging to the edge of a cliff, surrounded by jagged rock like crooked teeth. The roof sagged under snow from years past, but the stone foundation held firm. Luke had found the place during a winter storm as a boy. No one but trappers and ghosts came up this far. Inside, the cabin was dry and tight. Dust floated in the moonlight, slicing through the cracks. The stove was rusted but usable. A few crates and sacks remained, miners' leavings from another lifetime. Sarah collapsed on a blanket in the corner, cheeks wind-burned, eyes heavy. "Are we safe here?" Luke checked the single door, then the narrow window slit carved into the back wall. "Safe enough?" "Long as we're smart," he knelt beside her. "This place has got good bones. We'll hold here a few days. Wait them out." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter. "I'm scared, Luke." He didn't say it, but so was he. Morrison was more than a violent man. He was a hunter, a stalker who played with his prey. And if he'd made it this far, he wasn't going to give up now. Instead, Luke said, "Fear's just a warning bell. We don't let it run the place. We use it to stay sharp." She nodded slowly. "What if they find us?" "Then we make them wish they hadn't." He stood and crossed the room. From a crate beneath the cot, he pulled a length of rope, a rusted lantern, and a pair of mining tools. He handed Sarah the rope and showed her how to knot it into a snare. "You see this loop?" he asked. "Set it up near the path. If someone walks through not paying attention, it'll tighten around their ankle. Won't stop a horse, but a man. It'll slow him plenty." Sarah watched intently, mimicking his movements. Her hands were small, but steady. Luke was surprised how quickly she learned. Now this. He held up a tin cup with a length of twine. We hang this above the door. Trip line across the threshold. If someone opens it, it clatters loud enough to wake the dead. They worked together, rigging what they could. When the traps were set, Luke showed her how to signal if she got separated. A rock balanced on a stump meant all clear. 2 stacked stones meant danger. Sarah leaned against the wall. You learned all this growing up? Mostly from my father. The rest from the mountain herself. She teaches hard lessons, but they stick. There was silence for a moment. Then Sarah said, I wish I'd had a father like that. Luke turned toward her, surprised by the rawness in her voice. She didn't cry. Not this girl. But the ache was there, just beneath the surface. He walked over and sat beside her. You've got one now. She blinked, then looked down at her hands. Luke continued, voice low. Your mama wanted you raised by someone who'd never stop fighting for you. Elizabeth wanted it too. That's what I'm doing now. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a warning. Luke rose and moved to the window. Below, far down the slope, torchlight shimmered in the early dawn. The riders were still there, creeping closer. He turned to Sarah. Get some rest while you can. When the sun hits full, they'll try again. As she laid down, Luke reached into his coat and pulled out the adoption papers. He set them on the small table, lit the lantern, and began reading. Every line was a promise his wife never got to keep. And now it was his turn. Just before he doused the lantern, a shadow flickered past the cabin window. Quick, intentional. Luke froze. It was too early for Morrison to be that close, which meant he reached for his rifle and crossed the room silently. Sarah hadn't stirred. Luke opened the cabin door just a crack and scanned the slope. Nothing. Then behind him, a soft sound. Something shifting under the floorboards. He turned. Listened. Again. Silence. But his instincts were screaming now, because only someone who had studied this place would know the miner's cabin had a crawl space, and only someone who knew Luke Ashbourne's past would know exactly how to use it against him. The storm came with morning, not rain, but wind dry and sharp, tearing through the rocks like it had unfinished business with the land. It whistled low across the ridge, shaking pine limbs and dragging dust like a cloak across the mountain's shoulders. Luke had been ready since before dawn. He'd felt it in his bones. Something in the way the birds had gone silent, how even the squirrels had disappeared into the brush. The mountain had gone still. Now, from the narrow window of the cabin, he watched as 3 riders broke through the tree line below. The first was tall, hunched, his black coat flapping like wings. Morrison. The others fanned out, rifles across their saddles, eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. They weren't guessing anymore. They knew exactly where to go. Luke turned from the window. Sarah stood near the stove, holding the small bundle of dried meat and water they'd packed the night before. She looked at him, eyes wide but steady. They're here, she whispered. He nodded. I want you in the back corner. When I say the word, you crawl into that crawl space we talked about. Stay low. Don't come out till I call. I want to help. You already have. But if anything happens, you run. Don't look back. Head west till you find the trail. Someone will help you. I'm not leaving you, Luke. He stepped toward her, crouched, and took her hand. You're not leaving me. But I need you alive. More than I need you brave. She nodded reluctantly. He kissed her forehead, then moved to the door and checked the traps again. The trip wire by the entrance. The snare on the north side. One flare tucked inside the stovepipe, ready to light. And then it came. A sharp whistle from down the slope, followed by a voice. Luke Ashbourne, we ain't here to dance. Luke stood tall, opened the cabin door just enough to lean out. Wind tore at his coat. The three men had dismounted now, climbing up on foot. Morrison led, his black hat pulled low, one eye squinting against the gusts. Luke raised his voice. "You got no business here." Morrison laughed, the sound ugly and dry. "You got something belongs to me." Luke's fingers twitched on the grip of his rifle. "She doesn't belong to you." She never did. One of the men veered left, creeping up the rocks. Luke counted steps in his head. "Tell you what," Morrison called. "We'll trade." Girl for a quick death, Luke shut the door quietly. "Here we go." The first shot came from the left. It slammed into the cabin's corner post, sending splinters flying. Luke ducked and rolled, returning fire from the window. His bullet caught the man square in the chest. He dropped backward, rifle clattering to the ground. A second man stormed the door. Luke waited. As soon as the tripwire snapped, the tin cup fell, clanging against the doorframe. Sarah screamed from inside, "He's at the door!" That second of warning was all Luke needed. He turned and fired once clean. The man crashed through the doorway and crumpled inside, motionless. Only Morrison remained. The cabin was quiet now, save for the wind and Luke's ragged breathing. Then came the footsteps. Slow, measured, boots scraping against stone. Morrison appeared in the doorway, a Colt in one hand, blood streaked across his side. "Took you long enough," he rasped. Luke raised his rifle. "You're done." Morrison laughed again. "I've crossed 4 states for that girl. You think I'm walking away now?" Behind Luke, Sarah moved. She stepped out from the shadow of the stove. Small, shaking, but she stood tall. Morrison froze when he saw her. His face changed. Not soft, not fatherly, but hungry, possessive. "Sarah," he said, voice thick. "Sweetheart, it's been so long. I'm sorry, baby. Your mama." She twisted things. "I'm still your daddy." Sarah didn't flinch. "You're not my father," she said, voice trembling but clear. "You hurt my mother. You chased us like animals. You don't get to say who I belong to. You're my blood. I belong to the ones who protect me." Morrison's face twisted with rage. He lunged. Luke's rifle kicked once in his hands. The bullet caught Morrison square in the chest. The man stumbled, stared at the blood spreading across his shirt. Then he fell backward, his body hitting the floor with a final, breathless grunt. Silence. The wind howled through the broken door. Sarah dropped to her knees, hands shaking. Luke ran to her, pulled her close. She sobbed into his shoulder, all the fear and weight of the last few days crashing into her at once. "It's over," he whispered. "He won't touch you again." Her voice was barely a breath. "I know." They sat like that for a long time, the sun rising slowly behind them, casting gold across the mountain ridge. Luke finally stood, walking to the doorway. He looked down the slope. No more riders, no more torches, just the wind and the mountain, and a new day waiting to begin. Then he turned back toward Sarah and saw it. On the floor, beneath the edge of Morrison's coat, something glinted. A second revolver, loaded, still warm, which meant someone else had fired a shot. 6 months later, the wind blew softer over Bear Mountain. Spring had crept up through the frozen roots, nudging wildflowers from beneath the snowmelt and coaxing life back into every crack of the land. Luke Ashbourne stood outside his cabin with a hammer in one hand and a roll of tin in the other, squinting up at the new roof panels he'd just laid down. Sarah was inside, reading aloud from a book with a voice that grew steadier by the day. The sound of her laughter rose through the open window, mixing with bird song and the faint creak of the old rocking chair where she sometimes sat reading to her mama's memory. The cabin looked nothing like it had a year ago. The cold drafts were gone, patched over with new beams and insulation. The fireplace burned steady most evenings, warming both the air and the silences that once haunted the place. A patch of earth out back had been tilled, ready for the season's planting. Sarah had picked out marigolds and lavender. Luke had added rows of carrots and beans. Inside, on the table, next to a basket of eggs and a tin mug of honey tea, lay a folded piece of paper. Its seal still fresh, the ink slightly smudged from Sarah's excited fingers. It was her birth certificate. Name: Sarah Elizabeth Ashbourne. Father: Luke Ashbourne. Mother: deceased. The court hearing had taken place just 2 weeks earlier in Pine Ridge's modest courthouse. Judge Morley, a grizzled man with kind eyes, had listened quietly while Clara Henderson read from Elizabeth's final letter, and Luke stood tall with Sarah's hand wrapped in his own. "She's already mine," Luke had said, voice low but firm. "On paper or not, she's my daughter." The judge tapped the gavel once and said the words that changed everything. "Then let's make it legal." Afterward, the entire town watched as Luke lifted Sarah onto his shoulders, her curls flying in the wind, her cheeks red with joy. He didn't smile often, but that day he did. And folks who hadn't spoken to him in years started tipping their hats again. Some even shook his hand. Pine Ridge had changed since Morrison's end. The threat was gone, the fear lifted. Word had spread of what Luke had done up on the ridge, how he'd taken on 3 gunmen alone and walked away, carrying a child who wasn't his by blood, but by love. People respected that, respected him. Even the church ladies who once crossed the street when he came to town now sent baked goods to the cabin. Sarah had started school the week after the adoption, her name printed clean across a fresh slate. She was smart, quick to learn, and had already memorized more scripture than Luke had in a lifetime. This morning, as the wind rustled the new lace curtains Clara had sewn for them, Sarah sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, holding a small, cracked envelope in her lap. Elizabeth's handwriting, still elegant after all these years. She unfolded the letter slowly, her fingers reverent. "If you're reading this," it began, "then you're safe. And that means I did something right." Luke leaned in the doorway, arms folded, listening. "I want you to know that love isn't just something we fall into. It's something we choose over and over, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. Your mama chose you every day. And Luke, if you're there, thank you for making her dream real." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes damp but calm. "She loved you," she said. "I know," he answered. There was a pause, filled with wind and the creak of the rocking chair. Then Sarah asked, "Can I plant something today?" Luke raised an eyebrow. "Before lunch. I want to start the bluebells early. Mama said they were her favorite." He smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching like a rusty hinge. "Let's do it." They walked outside together, past the cabin and into the sun-warmed patch of earth near the fence. Luke handed her a small trowel. She knelt and pressed her hands into the soil like it was something sacred. While she worked, he scanned the tree line out of habit. No shadows, no riders, just the wind dancing between the pines and the whistle of a hawk overhead. He turned back to Sarah. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked. She looked up, brow furrowed. "Why? Better schools? Fancy cities? People with polished shoes and less dust?" She shook her head. "They don't have this." She pointed at the cabin, the mountain, the flowers. Then she pointed at him. "They don't have you." Luke swallowed, hard. Then he knelt beside her, took her small hand in his, and helped press the first seed into the ground. The wind picked up, sweeping a strand of hair across Sarah's cheek. She smiled and tucked it behind her ear. Luke glanced skyward, the light soft and golden, and thought of Elizabeth, how her hands used to move the same way through the soil, how her laughter sounded just like Sarah's when it danced across the porch. As they finished planting, Sarah looked up. Can we fix the swing next? Luke nodded. We'll do that after lunch. Then she said something else. Quiet, like a thought not meant for anyone to hear. Feels like she's here. Luke paused, then answered, That's because she is. But as he stood, wiping his hands on his pants, he noticed something at the edge of the field. A figure, distant, watching. Not Morrison, but someone else. And for the first time in weeks, Luke felt that prickling behind his neck again, because sometimes ghosts don't stay dead, and sometimes trouble has more than one face. The morning light came soft through the pine needles, spilling gold across the hillside like a blessing. Luke Ashbourne crouched at the edge of the cemetery plot just beyond the cabin, chisel in one hand, mallet in the other, tracing each letter into the smooth face of a thick cedar plank. It wasn't much of a monument. Nothing polished, nothing grand. Just a hand-carved wooden marker built from the very trees that watched over them each day. But it would last, and that mattered. He stepped back and looked at the finished words. Elizabeth Ashbourne, beloved wife and guardian angel. She taught us love is not holding on, but letting go so others can find their way home. The wind rustled through the grass. Sarah stood beside him, barefoot, a small bundle of blue forget-me-nots cupped in her palms. Somehow, despite the dry season and frost warnings, they'd bloomed again. It was almost impossible, like the mountain itself had given them back. Sarah knelt slowly and laid the flowers at the base of the marker. She would have liked this. She'd have cried, Luke said gently. Happy tears, though. Sarah took a breath, deep and steady. I still talk to her sometimes. Luke looked down at her. Me too. The two of them stood in silence, the kind that doesn't need words. Then, hand in hand, they turned and walked back to the cabin. Their home. The front porch was warm from the sun, a pie cooling on the railing, boots stacked neatly by the door. Chickens clucked in the small pen Luke had finally finished, and smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Inside, the room smelled of pine wood, lavender, and something sweet on the stove. Sarah moved to the window seat, her embroidery hoop in hand. She had a knack for needlework, now tiny flowers forming between her fingers, neat and steady. She didn't rush it. She said it helped her think. Luke settled into Elizabeth's old chair near the fire, the legs groaning under his frame. He opened the worn cookbook that had sat untouched for years, thumbed past flower-stained pages until he found a note scribbled in the margin. For Sarah's first birthday here. Something warm, something sweet. He cleared his throat and read aloud, voice a little rough, a little choked. 1 cup of buttermilk, half a teaspoon of nutmeg. Mix with clean hands, always with clean hands, Sarah smiled without looking up. I like her writing. It's kind, he nodded. She wrote like she lived. Gentle, but never weak. She kept stitching. Luke leaned back, eyes drifting toward the fire. You know, we got half a bag of flour left. Maybe tomorrow we try this one out. Sarah lifted her head. Can I help? I was counting on it. Outside, the shadows lengthened. The day softened. Later, as dusk painted the windows gold, Luke stepped out onto the porch and looked over the valley. The roof was solid now. The garden had green shoots pushing through the soil. And inside, a child who once had nowhere to go was humming as she stitched a future. He felt something shift in his chest. Not a sharp pain, he'd known that for years, but a loosening, a quiet ease. Happiness doesn't always come with trumpets, he thought. Sometimes it's just when one heart stops hurting and another finally starts to heal. Behind him, Sarah called, Daddy. He turned. It still caught him off guard sometimes, that word. How easily it fit, how much it meant. Yeah. You think we could have guests sometime? Maybe people like Mama helped. Luke nodded slowly. I think that's exactly what your mama would have wanted. She grinned, a flash of hope in the soft light. Then we'll need more pie. He laughed, full and deep, and stepped back inside. The screen door clicked shut behind him. Far off, past the hills and rising dust trails, another rider headed west. But that's another story. If this one found its way to your heart, you'll want to be here when the next tale begins. Out here in the West, legends don't die. They settle down, plant roots, and grow into something new. Subscribe to Western Legacy for the next chapter of courage, healing, and the kind of love that builds homes out of heartbreak. The frontier's still got stories to tell.